You may be seated. So, as Rabbi Roisman pointed out, Shabbat HaGadol, one of the reasons they referred to it, a later reason, of course, was that there was so much study in preparation for the holiday. And most of the study focused on chametz u'matzah, right? The complications of chametz, and of course this year the complication of Shabbat leading into the Seder. What do you do with the chametz? Because you have to have it gone by Friday, but you're allowed to eat it until, well, it depends on daylight savings. I think it's 11 a.m., but you can't have it in the house, but you can have it outside the house. That's what they studied. So studying on Shabbat HaGadol is the custom. So I thought I would share with you things that you could use in your Seder tonight or tomorrow night, some new insights. And they come from Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who was one of the premier, one of the greatest teachers of Torah of the latter part of the 20th century, right into the 21st century, until we lost him recently at a very comparatively young age. But his Torah is out there, and fortunately is being published. The stuff that wasn't published is now being published, and a lot of the material is something that we're looking at. One of the great things he did that many people are not familiar with, he has an entire commentary to the Haggadah, which is really, it's about that thick, and it's filled with incredible insights. So we're going to learn from Rabbi Sacks this morning some of his insights into the Haggadah and the structure of it and the whole idea of the matzah, the maror, and the Pesach. So we begin by looking at the yachatz. Okay, so here's an interesting question that Rabbi Sacks asked himself. When we have a meal, any meal, particularly a Shabbat or holiday meal, you begin with Birkat HaMotzi. That's how you begin the meal. You eat the challah. And when the meal's over, you do Birkat HaMazon. You don't then eat the challah again, do you? No, we eat dessert, but we don't eat the challah. Yet, on Passover, we eat the challah before the meal. We eat the matzah, and then we eat the matzah at the end of the meal as the last thing that we taste in our mouth. So yes, why is that such a peculiar custom? We know that so yachatz is the answer. Yachatz is the very beginning of the Seder. We break the matzah into two, put the big piece away, which becomes what became known as the afikomen. And the first part, the smaller part, is what we eat before the meal. So the answer he gives is that we have to realize that the matzah takes the place of the korban pesach, the paschal offering. The paschal offering was the central feature of the observance of Pesach for 1,000 years. Right? You offered the paschal lamb, and then you consumed it. You had a sli eish, you had to barbecue it. You weren't allowed to boil it. And then that was the last thing you ate. And after the Korban Pesach, you had that taste in your mouth, and you didn't eat anything else. Well, we don't have a Korban Pesach anymore. So the premier symbol of Pesach went from being this paschal lamb to being the matzah. So, because it takes the place of the Pesach lamb, it has to be saved for the end of the meal. If it replaces the Korban Pesach, then it has to be the last thing we eat. And that's the reason that the matzah is eaten at the end of the meal. There's another reason he offers. First, the matzah is the bread of affliction, right? Halach ma'anya, this is the bread of affliction, this is the bread of the poor person, this is the bread that the slaves ate. But at the end, it becomes the bread of freedom. Why? Because remember the story. We eat matzah, not only because they ate matzah as slaves, because it was the cheapest food and it filled your belly and made you think you weren't hungry, and it was very, very cheap, but also we ate matzah when we fled Egypt, right? That's what we took with us. As we went in freedom, the dough didn't rise, because they were rushing, right? And rushing means that it didn't have time to rise. And we eat matzah because it's the bread of freedom. So because it's the bread of affliction, but it's also the bread of freedom, Rabbi Sacks points out that's why you have to eat it twice. You have to eat it as the bread of affliction before the meal, And at the end of the meal, we've now gone free, and the second part of the Haggadah is all about the freedom, the redemption. So you have to eat the matzah of redemption because it has two meanings. It's a dual symbol. The way the slaves ate, they hid a piece of matzah, right? A slave would not eat everything he or she was given in the morning. They would hide a little bit to make sure there was some food later on in case they weren't fed at the end of the day. So everything about the matzah reminds us of slavery, and everything we do physically, break it in half, hide a piece of matzah. Then it became the shtick with the children, but it didn't originate as a shtick with the children. It was imitating slavery. Hide the piece of matzah, and then eat it as the last thing because it represents the Korban Pesach. So that's what the Yachitz is all about, turning the matzah into the Korban Pesach, the Paschal Lamb, and reminding us that it's a symbol of slavery, but it's also a symbol of freedom. And the only difference is it's the same matzah, but if you eat it as a free person, it's delicious. If you eat it as a slave, it's horrible. It's the status of the person eating it that matters. Then the Magid section. The Magid section we know is the main part of the Haggadah. That's even the word, Haggadah, Magid, to tell the story. And the Magid is 85% is the telling of the story. And he points out beautifully that Magid comes from the word that also means to bind or to connect in Hebrew. It's not only to tell, it's to bind or connect. The telling of the story is what connects one generation to the next. So the telling, the goal is to connect the generations. And that's why the Seder has so much about the children. They are the focus. From the very beginning, Manishtana, right at the beginning, and then the four sons, the four different children, and then the search for the Afikomen, and then the fun songs at the end of the Seder. All of it is designed because the goal of the Seder is to connect one generation to the next, and you only accomplish that by telling the story. Any civilization that doesn't tell the story of how it came about, what its founding principles are, and the purpose of that community, of that civilization, will die. Because it can't connect the next generations to it, and they will not fight to preserve it, and they won't even know what it is to preserve. Then he refers to Halach Ma'anya. That's when we lift up the bread and we invite people to join us for the Seder. What hospitality is it to offer the hungry the bed of suffering? He says, here we go. Here you are, all those who are hungry. Here's the worst piece of bread I could possibly offer you. The bread of affliction. Would you like a piece? He says, what kind of hospitality is that? So he asks this question. What transforms bread of affliction into the bread of freedom is the willingness to share it with others. When you're willing to share your bread with others, you're a free person. And then he brings us, and if there's anything you take with you to tonight's Seder or tomorrow's night, it's this astounding story by Primo Levi. Primo Levi became a philosopher, and he was in Auschwitz when it was abandoned. And along with others, they were able to hide, and they were not taken on the death march. Now, Primo Levi was a young man in Auschwitz, and he tells this story. There was very little food and very little fuel. Now remember, Auschwitz was abandoned in the winter, so it's very, very cold. He worked to light a fire and bring some warmth to the prisoners. Many of the prisoners were near death. They couldn't even move. They were just sitting there in a barracks where they were hiding, and they couldn't even get up. But he was a young man, and there were a few other young men. And they said, we got to get some warmth in here or they're going to die. When the broken window was repaired and the stove began to spread its heat, something seemed to relax in everyone at that moment. Tawarowski, one of the prisoners, proposed to the others that each of them offer a slice of bread to us three who had been working all day. So those who were laying there near death watched these young men struggling, using their energy, right? Using their energy, using it up. Who knows when they would need it? When would they be discovered by the Russians were coming, and who would liberate them? Yet they worked all day. So one of the prisoners says, you know what we got to do? We have to share our bread with them. Look what they did for us. They closed the window. They cut down wood. They made a fire. And it was agreed. It was the first human gesture that occurred among us. It was the beginning of the change by which we who had not died slowly changed from prisoners to men again. Sharing food is the first act through which slaves become free human beings. One who fears tomorrow does not offer his bread to others. One who shares shows himself capable of fellowship and faith, the two things which hope is born. That is why we begin the Seder by inviting others to join us. Bread shared is no longer the bread of affliction. It maybe allows a piece of matzah, but because you shared it, it's now the bread of freedom. Reaching out to others, giving help to the needy, and companionship to those who are alone, we bring freedom into the world, and with freedom, we bring God into the world. That story explains why the matzah, the bread of affliction, is what we share. The sharing is the act of freedom. It's the act of fellowship. It's the act of redemption. This year we are here. Next year may we be in Israel. So we go to page 2. The Seder brings the three dimensions of time together. So this year we're here. Next year we're in Israel. So we're at the Seder, we're already thinking about the future. We're already thinking about next year's Seder. So he points out the Seder brings the three dimensions of time together. Before the meal, we tell the story of the redemption of the past. During the meal, we experience it in the present. After the meal, as we conclude the Hallel, we say next year in Jerusalem, redemption of the future. The lesson, those who remember the past have faith in the future. We can face it without fear because we have been there before. And many of the hostages who have come out and who have survived have told how last Passover they sat amongst each other and told the story. They didn't have the bitterness they had. They had the maror. They didn't have the wine. They didn't have the matzah. They didn't have the charoset. But they had the story. And they sat around and told the story, and it gave them hope for the future, that just as the redemption occurred in Egypt, so too the redemption will come for them. The Maggid section, Rabbi Sachs's commentary. The narrative was moved from after the meal to before it, so that words would do the work of place. The Jews no longer had Jerusalem, but we still had the story. The city, the land, the temple lay in ruins, but the words remained. So he's pointing out that during the time of the temple, when people made pilgrimage and they were there in Jerusalem, they had the holy temple and the walls of Jerusalem and the glamour and beauty of Jerusalem, that place, being there was already the excitement. Being there was already the high. That's all you needed. And we know, you experience that. You go to Jerusalem, you walk, you're standing in front of the kotel. It doesn't matter if you say a word. Being there is already the experience. But now, the Jews were not in Jerusalem looking at the Holy Temple. They were in Babylonia, or they were in Alexandria, or later on they were in Poland or Russia or wherever it was. And the place certainly was not inspirational. So what he points out is the story replaces the place. So before the meal, you have to tell the story, because before the meal, in temple days, they were looking at the temple. They were getting ready to sacrifice the Paschal Lamb. It was an amazing moment just physically being there and seeing 1 million Jews come from all over Israel to Jerusalem to observe the holiday. And the beauty of the temple and the high priest with all their fancy clothing and all this incredible ritual, that's all you needed. Now we had nothing. So in place of all that, the rabbis put the story, which is why, as I said, 85% of the Haggadah is telling the story, because it replaced the experience of being in the temple in Jerusalem to observe the holiday. The 4 questions, of course, parallel the 4 different children. So he points out, the wise child, what does he ask about? He asks about the Paschal Lamb. He goes straight to the central symbol. He gets it. The wicked child, he asks about the maror. Why? Because he doesn't like anything that's going on. He was bitter before he sat down. He doesn't need any maror. He came with an attitude. So he asks about the bitterness. The simple child is just looking around, and the act of dipping is weird. Why are you doing that? Because he didn't do that in that period of time. So they're seeing something different, and we know the children are very much alerted to something different, a change in the routine. And the one that doesn't know how to ask, that is the reclining. So you parallel the 4 questions with the 4 symbols, and each one reflects the different type of child or the different levels we go through. One child who goes from being young, doesn't know anything, to not sure what to ask, but is impressed by what's going on, to being the rebellious teenager, to hopefully being the adult who now reflects upon his past and wants to learn. And finally, let's finish up at Avadim Hayinu. So that is the first answer, right? Why is this night different from all other nights? Avadim Hayinu, the Farber Mitzrayim. We were slaves to Egypt. That's an obvious answer. So the Jewish story begins in sadness and ends in joy, right? We were slaves, now we're free, l'chaim. But Rav Shmuel had a different answer. Rav Shmuel, the central fact is physical redemption. Rav has a different answer. The essential theme is spiritual redemption, right? Why? Because he talks about not that we were slaves, but remember there's a paragraph that says, our ancestors were idol worshipers, and we finally outgrew it. We finally learned to worship the one God, monotheism, to acknowledge the one creator. So why are there 2 different answers? So the reason is that one of them is focused on the physical redemption, and the other is focused on the spiritual redemption. One is slavery to freedom, and the other is the enslaved mind who believes in the nonsense of paganism, right? Of polytheism, of worshiping idols. Maimonides draws a third distinction, points out Rabbi Sachs. The story we tell our children and the story we tell ourselves. Rav Shmuel, focuses on the story as it's told to a child. The answer to the child is, we were once slaves in Egypt, we had no freedom, we were forced labor, it was difficult, they didn't feed us, they didn't treat us right. A child can understand it. Rav speaks to the adults, because only an adult can understand the journey from paganism to monotheism. You can't explain to a kid about paganism, monotheism. It's much too sophisticated. So what we see, as Rabbi Sachs points out, the brilliance of the Haggadah is it relates to every age. It relates to every attitude. The wise child who wants to learn more, the rebellious child who doesn't even want to be there, but he did show up, so at least we have a chance. And then the children who aren't sure what's going on. But then he says, you can't only be child-oriented. You have to relate to the adults as well. You've got to talk on a sophisticated level so that they learn also. It's not only for the children, it's for the adults. And that's why they talk about going from paganism to monotheism. So in a modern world, it means to reject the modern idols, right? The idolatry of consumerism or the idolatry of bowing down to dictators, or the idolatry of being infected by the radical part of a religious tradition that causes you to go out, murder, kill, and rape. All these things are new idolatries that have grabbed people. And he says that's what you have to talk about amongst the adults. The kids, you keep it simple. The adults, and the brilliance that I got is the balance. It has what we need for the children, and then it has sophisticated stuff for the adults. And I'll finish this final example. Elijah the prophet. Elijah the prophet for kids, it's such a cool idea. We open a door and we're talking about a spirit coming in, and there's a trick usually if you got little kids. When you sing Eliyahu Navi, you give a little, you give a knee to the table and the wine cup shakes and they think Eliyahu is there drinking the wine. And kids love it. It's a cool thing. It's a ghost coming, right? And you can say something simple to them. Elijah represents peace and hope. And the kid relates to it. That's one level. On the next level, you talk about freeing hostages. and you talk about redemption, and you talk about the end of conflict, you talk about Messianic era. How do you bring a Messianic era? Who's going to bring the Messianic era? How do you move towards peace, not only in your own society, but in the world? Now you're on an adult level. So every symbol has an answer to the child, an answer to the adults, and the Haggadah weaves them. So when there's a lot of little children, it tends to focus more on the kids. When there's fewer children, you shift more to the sophisticated part of the Haggadah. And as Rabbi Sachs teaches us, the Haggadah has the brilliance of being able to teach at every level, on the simplest level and on the most profound level. And when we balance that, we end up with a wonderful, wonderful Seder, which everybody comes out learned, and everybody comes out excited to have experienced this over 3,000-year-old tradition. Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach.